Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join this session. My name is Agnieszka Raczyńska. I'm a visiting fellow at the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies at Brown University. I'm currently working also for the migration program at Fundación Avina. It's a pleasure to welcome you all for the Human Rights and Humanitarianism in Action dialogue series at the intersection of human rights and humanitarian aid. This is a series of virtual events organized by the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies and co-sponsored this time by the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at Brown University. So today is my pleasure to welcome our two expert speakers, two human rights defenders dedicated to defending and promoting human rights, and in particular, the rights of migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. Thank you, Margaret and Daniel, for joining us today. Margaret Cargioli is the managing attorney at the Immigrant Defenders Law Center, and Daniel Berlin is the deputy director of Asylum Access Mexico. Margaret and Daniel will walk us through the promises made by President Biden to the refugees and asylum seekers during his campaign, and the first steps that his administration has taken to address the political and administrative challenges in reconstructing the U.S. asylum system. It is a pleasure to have you both here today, and we are very thankful for the effort and the time you both have taken to be here and to prepare this presentation and this session. I have just a couple of practical pieces of information for all the participants. One, we have interpretation in Spanish and English. So for those of you who need interpretation, just click the interpretation sign at the bottom of your screen. And two, I will be collecting questions for Daniel and Margaret during their presentation. And all the questions and comments will be answered at the end of the session. So without further delays, Margaret and Daniel, thank you again, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Agnieszka. I am Margaret Cargioli, Managing Attorney of the Cross-Border Initiative Program at Immigrant Defenders Law Center, and I'm going to talk about some of the changes of recent that have happened under the Biden administration, and talk about some of the things that we are still hoping the Biden administration will change to positively impact U.S. asylum. So, as many of you know, unfortunately, under the Trump administration, there were very serious and egregious asylum policies placed upon the U.S. southern border. The Trump administration went out of its way to implement severely restrictive and harmful immigration policies overall. At the U.S. southern border, we saw some of the most egregious policies put in place, such as the Migrant Protection Protocols program and the HARP program and PACER, and I'll be talking about a few of those policies today. One of the policies that has had a hugely negative impact on persons that are trying to reach the United States for safety and protection is metering. Metering actually was implemented by Barack Obama's administration, and when Haitians began coming or trying to come to the United States through the U.S. southern border. It was more widely and used by the Trump administration. Trump made it a stronger policy, and currently there are 16,000 people on the metering list. The metering list is something that sounds more legitimate than it actually functions. It's something very important to understand about how harmful this metering list is that it's very rudimentary and leaves many asylum seekers on the list vulnerable to be harmed, for people to try to take their place. It's not managed by the U.S. government in a way that would not secure, these types of harms or people being, subjected to, harm with regard to others wanting to sell their place. I mean, there have been, unfortunately, on the ground, many problems with the way the metering list actually functions. And that's very important to keep in mind. It's quite literally a piece of paper where individuals write down their information and then have to wait to be called and have no idea when they'll be called to present at a port of entry to be able to seek asylum in the United States. And these metering lists are across the US southern border at various points of entry. Biden has yet to address this, which is quite concerning because of not only the number of individuals that are on the list, but remember keeping in mind that these are persons that fled due to harm in their country of origin, and unfortunately then are subject to having to wait in dangerous border cities across the US southern border with Mexico because they're anxiously awaiting when they would possibly be called off of the list. As I mentioned prior, one of the harshest policies we saw under the Trump administration was the Migrant Protection Protocols program. It began on January 24th, 2019. It first began, it was announced that it was only going to be applied to adult males from certain Central American countries. And then it gradually started to increase and become a stronger program, and single women, pregnant women, families with young children were all placed in the program. And it's applicable to Spanish-speaking countries and Brazil. At the very last few months prior to the pandemic, Brazil was added. And so there are a few Brazilians that have been placed in the Migrant Protection Protocols program. And basically what it entails is that anyone not anyone, but people that were placed in this program who had come to the US southern border seeking asylum or had entered the United States without inspection and were apprehended by officials were placed in removal proceedings. They had a case open in US immigration courts, yet they were sent back to Mexico and were told to wait there, and that they would have to present at US ports of entry at the US southern border to attend their court hearings. This left many people vulnerable to harm, to risk of kidnapping, and very serious and egregious, unfortunate events because of the dangerous places where they were made to wait, such as Matamoros, Tijuana, places where the US government itself advises US citizens not to travel to. About 70,000 people were returned under the Migrant Protection Protocols program, all throughout some of the cities that I've mentioned. We are very grateful that the Biden administration has ceased enrollment of anyone else into the Migrant Protection Protocols program. That's one of the changes that he implemented as of January 21st, 2021. Hearings have been suspended since the pandemic, and a phased reentry program has started under the Biden administration. As of Friday of last week in the San Isidro Port of Entry in San Diego, the US government has begun to permit 25 individuals in the Migrant Protection Protocols program to be paroled into the United States. Every day since then, 25 people have been enrolled and have been paroled into the United States and disenrolled from the program. They're being allowed to reunify with their family and sponsors in the United States. Unfortunately, one of the policies that still remains in place is Title 42. Under the Trump administration, Title 42 was implemented with the purpose of allegedly protecting people, from the pandemic, and it was used as a tool really to target asylum seekers. And it's very clear that that is the purpose, because every day since Title 42 has been into place, except for one day that I can recall in San Isidro Port of Entry that was closed, generally speaking, almost every day, thousands of people are allowed to enter the United States at U.S. ports of entry. Anything that's considered essential travel is permitted. So people that have to work, et cetera, are permitted, except asylum seekers were excluded and not considered essential travel. So what that means is that if an asylum seeker presents at a U.S. port of entry right now, because the Biden administration has still not made a change to this, an asylum seeker can either be returned to their country of origin or sent back to Mexico. Trump implemented this harshly, and thousands of people were returned to their country of origin or Mexico. And unfortunately, we've seen that the Biden administration has continued to implement Title 42. We know that in February, hundreds of Haitians were returned to their country of origin. We understand that quite a number of those were because of Title 42. There is an exception to Title 42. The US government should be permitting survivors of torture to have an interview with an asylum officer, and if subjected to torture, they should not be returned to their country of origin. But that is a very, very high standard, and it's incumbent upon the person that is asking for protection from the United States to raise this with officials. So if the person does not specifically say that they are afraid of torture, they might not get a Convention Against Torture assessment, and these people can be returned to their country of origin and subjected to danger. There have been 300,000 expulsions under Title 42, and unfortunately, even today, it's still in effect, even though public health experts have called for the rescission of Title 42, saying that this is not necessary. There are other public measures, safety measures that can be put into place to allow asylum seekers. And just as every day now we're seeing that the US government is safely able to allow MPP respondents to enter the United States and reunify with family and sponsors. Another harsh and extremely alarming policy that the Trump administration implemented was the Asylum Cooperative agreements. These were agreements with the countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And the United States government, which clearly was implementing xenophobic policies, as we all know, before that Trump even came to power, he disparaged Mexicans and said very derogatory things about Haiti, according to some sources. He created these agreements in a way to just continue to try to prevent asylum seekers from countries that have one of the highest criminal records in the world from being able to seek asylum in the United States. So essentially, people that were seeking asylum in the United States at the US southern border could be returned to Guatemala, for example, if they were from El Salvador or Honduras. Mind you, these countries themselves, as I said, are some among the most dangerous in the world. They had no have hardly any infrastructure to process asylum seekers. And the United States was sending men, families, pregnant women to dangerous places with the guise that they could seek safety therein. Mind you, these countries are adjacent to each other. Many of the reasons why people flee these countries have to do with very dangerous gangs that have actually infiltrated all of these countries. So it was actually sending people back to places where some of the people that were actually harming them and persecuting them, for which they had to leave, could now easily find them in a neighboring country. We are extremely happy that the Biden administration ended this policy because it was one of the most alarming policies that were put into place. Family separation was one of the practices that that received one of the biggest public outcry, when we all recall hearing the young children crying out for their parents because they had been ripped apart from their parents at the US southern border. Unfortunately, family separation is endemic in immigration law. We all are very keen and aware about what happened to those families at the US southern border, and that they were separated so that the Trump administration could criminally prosecute the adults who had crossed through the criminal justice system while keeping their children in anguish separated from them. Due to public outcry, this was, it did come to an end. It was terminated by the Trump administration. And we know that, unfortunately, there continued to be family separation in the way that immigration policies operate without purposefully ensuring that our policies are as humane as possible. It can continue to happen. And it did happen under the Migrant Protection Protocols program, for example, whereby, for instance, one of my first clients was a 19-year-old girl. She presented at the port of entry in San Isidro with her mom and her younger siblings. The US government allowed her mother and younger siblings to enter the United States to seek asylum. And they placed my 19-year-old client into the Migrant Protection Protocols program and sent her back to Mexico alone. Unfortunately, that we saw a lot under the MPP program, and we see it in other areas of immigration law. We see it in detention centers where ICE may put a father in a detention center and separate him from his wife and children, and keeping this person in a jail solely because, for example, the person had maybe been pulled over for having a broken taillight, and that's what started a whole process, which will now then separate this father from his family. Biden has created a task force to address the zero tolerance policy that we all are very aware of when the children were ripped apart from their parents. As of the 628 parents are still separated. I believe there has been a recent change as of this week, and there may be a few more that have been reunified, as far as I understand. We are extremely grateful for the task force. One thing that we think would be very important would be for the administration to address reparations, some kind of resources for these children and families that have been traumatized from that program. And we would strongly hope that the Biden administration not detain families in detention centers. It doesn't matter if it's a cage or if it's a tent like was in Tornillo, or if it's considered a family detention center. It's a restrictive and harsh policy that's unnecessary. And within that system, also families are separated, and who is sent to a detention center or who is allowed to be paroled into the United States. We believe all people should be treated with dignity and respect and should not be subjected to family separation in any form. And another matter that I would like to highlight is with regard to the current policies that we're seeing at the U.S. southern border. I just want to note that we believe that the Biden administration, as they have clearly created a great program to welcome persons that are being disenrolled from MPP, that can also be used as a model for allowing people out of the metering list and ensuring that people don't have to be subjected to Title 42. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Margaret. And of course, thank you for all the amazing work that you and all your colleagues at IMDEF are doing, both the advocacy on individual clients and on a more systemic level. And also thank you to Agnieszka for organizing this, and of course to the Watson Institute for hosting this. We feel this is a really important discussion to have, and we're glad to have a forum to do so. My name is Dan Berlin. I'm the Deputy Director of Asylum Access Mexico, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how these policies and some others have affected the human rights situation for asylum seekers and refugees within Mexico, both at the border and in the interior. Before I get to that, I want to talk just a little bit about my organization, Asylum Access. So UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, estimates that there are about 26 million refugees worldwide, 26 million people who've been forced to flee their homes due to some form of persecution. And while many of these people have hope to end up somewhere like the United States or Canada or Europe eventually, and many of them do, the vast majority of them spend a significant amount of time in countries that are adjacent to the countries from which they fled. So most refugees worldwide live in the countries that are next door to the countries where they had to leave. And Asylum Access works in those countries to ensure that the people who want to or are forced to rebuild their lives in their first countries of asylum have the tools to do so in a dignified manner. And even those who are eventually resettled to the United States or to Europe or to Canada or to Australia, typically the wait times are more than a decade, sometimes up to 20 years. So our vision is that during that period, people are not relying on the humanitarian aid from UN agencies, from other organizations, that they're able to really begin to rebuild their lives. They're able to participate meaningfully in society, to get jobs, to access education, to raise their own voices in defense of their own rights. So in Mexico, what that looks like is we have 7 offices throughout Mexico, both in northern and southern Mexico, providing direct representation to asylum seekers who are seeking asylum in Mexico, within Mexico's asylum system. And while many people don't view Mexico as a country that is host to refugees, in fact, it actually has a long history of both being a country of origin for migration. So obviously there are millions and millions of Mexicans who travel to the US and elsewhere, both for economic reasons and to seek asylum and for other reasons. But Mexico is also a very important transit country. So throughout its history, people from Central America and elsewhere have crossed through Mexico en route to the United States. And Mexico has also long played a role welcoming refugees. So throughout the civil wars in Guatemala and El Salvador and Nicaragua, in the 70s and 80s, Mexico has a long tradition of welcoming refugees and has hosted thousands and thousands of refugees who had to flee from those conflicts and others, and have rebuilt lives in Mexico. And we view Mexico, we view Mexico's response to refugee issues as part of a broader broader response. So obviously the US has an extremely important role in welcoming refugees and asylum seekers, a role that we stepped away from during the Trump administration in really dramatic and terrifying ways. But the US's role, there's plenty of room to improve both pre and post-Trump in the way that the US welcomes refugees. Nonetheless, Mexico also has an opportunity to provide protection to certain populations who either don't want to go to the US or are going to be ineligible for asylum in the US. Mexico views the definition of a refugee in a different way than the United States does. The US's definition of refugee comes directly from the UN Refugee Convention. And basically, to win refugee status in the United States, you have to show that you face persecution in your home country, that you had to flee your home country because your life was in danger, you were in danger of having your rights violated. But more than that, you also have to show that this persecution was related to some characteristic of the person seeking asylum. So you have to show that you were persecuted because of your race, because of your religion, because of your ethnicity, your membership in a certain group, or your political opinion. And this is often really hard to do. A lot of people flee their countries because something terrible happened to a family member, or their neighborhoods are unsafe. And it's not always clear that that happened because of some certain characteristic of the person. It can be really hard to prove, and sometimes it's just not the case. Mexico has adopted the same refugee definition that comes from the UN Convention, but it's also adopted a much broader definition that applies throughout a lot of Latin America. That comes from the Cartagena Declaration. It was a lot of Latin American countries got together in, I believe it was 1982, and decided that the UN definition of a refugee wasn't good enough. A lot of people are fleeing civil wars in Latin America. A lot of people are fleeing general human rights violations. And while there wasn't necessarily an individual persecution, those people still cannot rely on their own governments to protect their lives, and they had to leave their country. So in Mexico, somebody can receive refugee status by showing that they fled a civil war, that they fled an external conflict, that they fled a situation of generalized violence, or that they fled a situation of massive human rights violations in their country. And Mexico has recognized that in, for example, Honduras, El Salvador, Venezuela, those three countries are all characterized by either generalized violence or massive human rights violations. So people who flee those situations can be recognized as refugees much more easily in Mexico than in countries that only apply the UN definition. And that's evident in the approval rates. So in 2020 in Mexico, Hondurans and Salvadorans who had their cases decided had over an 80% approval rate for refugee status. And Venezuelans, it was 98%. 98% of Venezuelans who had their cases decided last year were approved for refugee status. Now, if you compare that to the US statistics, it's about 27% in last fiscal year of asylum seekers were ultimately approved for refugee status. And for Northern Triangle asylum seekers, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, it's about 13%. And in some immigration courts, because this varies widely depending on the immigration court, the numbers can be as low as like 2 or 3% approval rates. So for certain populations, there's more of an opportunity to receive refugee status in Mexico. Does that mean that Mexico can take the US's role in protecting refugees? Absolutely not. There are many, many people who are not safe in Mexico. As Margaret mentioned, a lot of Central Americans are fleeing gang violence, and these gangs, while they're present in the Northern Triangle, they're also present in Mexico. There's also obviously a lot of security issues within Mexico, particularly in the northern border, where many of the victims of Trump's immigration policies were sent to, and the stories that are abundant of violence and persecution against migrants and asylum seekers in Mexico illustrate that for a lot of people, Mexico is not a safe option. That said, we do have clients that are able to seek asylum, in particular in areas that are not necessarily in Matamoros or Nuevo Laredo or some of these very dangerous areas, and who are able to begin rebuilding their lives in Mexico. And we view Mexico as really having an opportunity to continue to play a greater role. I want to talk a little bit about Mexico's current government and their stance towards refugees, because it's complicated. The current president of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, campaigned on a very pro-migrant platform. He campaigned as kind of an antidote to Donald Trump, and he promised to stick up both for the rights of Mexican migrants abroad, and in particular in the United States, but also for migrants and refugees within Mexico. And indeed, when he took office, he did make some very important policy decisions that were good for migrants and asylum seekers. Right after he took office, some of the caravans began arriving in southern Mexico from Central America. And rather than expel them, AMLO's government actually issued humanitarian visas to many of these people, which allowed them to transit through Mexico safely. Unfortunately, in summer of 2019, the Trump administration, in addition to implementing all of these terrible policies that Margaret mentioned, engaged in a really concerted external pressure campaign against Mexico to basically force Mexico to reverse its pro-migrant stance, to stop facilitating transit through Mexico, or safe transit. And after receiving some very serious threats of tariffs that would have crippled the Mexican economy, AMLO did basically a 180-degree shift and really began cracking down on migrants and refugees in a way that had a huge impact on the rights of our clients and many migrants and refugees in Mexico. So he sent thousands of National Guard troops to the southern border, and recent caravans have been very forcibly turned back at the Mexican border. The detention and deportation systems they've always been present in Mexico, and they have been significantly ramped up over the last few years. The government even has threatened like private bus carriers with prosecution under anti-trafficking laws if they transport undocumented migrants across the country. And the effect has been it's much harder for migrants to transit through Mexico. And what this hasn't done is stop migration. What it has done is push migrants into much more dangerous routes. So you see a lot more reliance on human traffickers. You see a lot more, this has been a boon to the drug cartels who control a lot of the human trafficking routes as well as the drug trafficking routes. And we see evidence of this in the most horrific forms. Just a month ago, there was a massacre in Tamaulipas state of more than a dozen Guatemalan migrants who, actually many of them had been deported or at least one of them was deported under a big immigration raid that Trump had orchestrated in Mississippi, and was making his way back through Mexico with at least a dozen of his compatriots from Guatemala. And rather than be able to buy a bus ticket and cross Mexico safely with a visa, they were forced to rely on human traffickers who had some fallout with the local cartels, and there was a massacre of more than a dozen people who were stuffed in the back of a pickup truck and set on fire and found in Camargo, Tamaulipas, just a few months ago. And there's also evidence that the Mexican police, the state police, were responsible in some way for this. So the outcomes of this externalization of the border have been really terrible and tragic. And unfortunately, we haven't had any clear commitment from the Biden administration that they are going to roll this back. And in fact, we have heard some, or at least one fairly high-level Biden administration official congratulate Guatemala for cracking down on a caravan that was coming to Guatemala right during the inauguration. Congratulate the president of Guatemala for their forcible response to this caravan. So we are not super optimistic that this is going to change. Now, getting back to Mexico, as I mentioned, Mexico has a fairly robust refugee system in place. Its refugee agency, COMAR, the Commission for the Assistance of Refugees, has been around since 2013. Mexico's had its own refugee law since 2011, and has been processing asylum claims since then. Since 2011, there's been more than 175,000 people who have submitted a petition for asylum in Mexico, and there have been almost 50,000 grants of some form of protection during that time. And as you can see from this graph, there was a kind of steady increase of applications for asylum from 2013 through 2018. And then between 2018 and 2019, there was this huge spike. It was more than 100% increase. The petitions went from about 35,000 to more than 70,000. And this obviously coincided with all of the policy changes that Margaret discussed. So MPP, metering, the ACAs made it so much harder for asylum seekers to seek protection in the United States that many were forced to seek asylum in Mexico. And this really overwhelmed the system. The second line, the green line on this chart, shows the budget of Comar, which had remained basically unchanged for the last 5 years. It hovered around 20 million pesos, which is about $1 million a year. While the increase in petitions went up, fivefold over this period. So while I mentioned the good grant rates that we see in Mexico, that doesn't really help somebody if they're waiting a year and a half for a response, and that's what we're seeing. The system was just totally overwhelmed in 2019, and many of our clients are waiting more than a year for a decision. Many are waiting months just to get their documents that prove that they're an asylum seeker. And this has a huge impact on people's lives because it's very difficult in Mexico to find formal employment, to enroll your kids in school, to seek health services, to open a bank account, to do any of the kind of daily things that you need to do in life without these formal documents. And under Mexican law, the process should only be 45 days. So it's not such a big deal. If you have to wait 45 days, you can rely on some assistance from the UN or from shelters. But if you're waiting a year and a half for a decision, it's really, really difficult to take your kids out of school for a year and a half, or to not find any formal employment. So this has been a major issue that we have been working with the government and fighting with the government about over the past several years. And while the numbers were down in 2020 due to the pandemic, it was still the second highest number of petitions that Mexico's ever received, more than 40,000. And Comar's budget did increase last year, but they've actually decreased Comar's budget for this current year by about 14%. So we're very concerned about the issues of Comar not growing to meet the demands of the Mexican asylum system. And obviously last year was a very difficult year, for everybody, but in particular for vulnerable populations like asylum seekers and refugees. What we saw during the pandemic was, to its credit, Comar continued to receive asylum petitions. This wasn't true of asylum systems all over the world, but it got rid of all of its deadlines for issuing decisions. So the cases just continued to pile up throughout 2020. The numbers, there were around 80,000 people in line waiting for decisions the last that we heard, many waiting for very long times to get their decisions. And throughout this period, Mexico continued to detain migrants, not for any criminal violation, just for their migration status. This was hugely concerning because the Mexican detention system is not set up to provide the kind of sanitation and social distancing and testing and medical support that it needs to be able to safely detain people during the pandemic. So we filed lawsuits. Lots of our partner organizations filed lawsuits against this and had some success in lowering detention numbers for most of the summer of last year. But unfortunately, we're seeing upticks in detention, and we have seen several cases of asylum seekers and migrants contracting COVID in the detention system in Mexico. And the other issue is when migrants are released from detention, they typically end up in shelters, and the shelters are also under-resourced. They do not have the ability to really protect people against COVID. We've had a lot of outbreaks in shelters throughout Mexico. We've really tragically lost some of the strongest defenders for migrant rights in Mexico. Some of these shelter directors who've been around forever, standing up for migrant rights, have died from COVID. So it's a very complicated situation. And while the numbers have declined a bit during the pandemic, we're seeing an uptick right now. January of 2021 saw the 5th highest number of refugee petitions and of asylum petitions in Mexico's history. So we're at about the same numbers that we were in the peak of 2019 for January 21. And you know, the numbers that our offices in the South are seeing is just like a constant influx of people. And while it's always a little hard to disentangle, you know, the immigration wonks talk about the push factors and pull factors. You know, the push factors, the reason people are leaving Central America and other countries, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Venezuela, Cuba, those reasons are still there. But people talk about the pull factor of the election of Biden. And it's hard to say whether people are coming into Mexico because of Biden's election. But the numbers are increasing. And what we have seen is there is a lot of expectation among our clients and other migrant communities for positive changes in the United States. People were paying very close attention to the US elections, and there was kind of a sigh of relief when it finally became clear that Trump lost and was going to leave office. But there is also a ton of uncertainty because, as Margaret mentioned, there have been a few changes that have been very positive. So, you know, the no new enrollments in MPP, the unwinding of MPP for the people who have currently open cases, the ending of the ACAs, the ending of the construction on the wall. Like, these are all positive developments. But most of these changes don't have any impact for the vast majority of people that we interact with. The unwinding of MPP right now is only going to affect people with open cases, and that's like a maximum of 25,000 people of the 70,000 who were placed at MPP. It doesn't affect at all the hundreds of thousands of people in Title 42. It doesn't impact the people on the metering lists. And the border is still closed for all intents and purposes. An asylum seeker cannot really present at the US border. There have been some changes for unaccompanied minors, but generally, people who show up at the US border now are going to receive pretty similar treatment to people who showed up at the US border 6 months ago. And for us and for our partners and for everybody who's advising migrants and refugees and asylum seekers right now, it's very difficult because our only answers are we don't know. You know, we know what the campaign said, we know what people are thinking about, but there haven't been any changes in like a lot of these issues. And yeah, there's an immigration bill kind of winding its way through the political process, but there are different levels of expectations for how successful that'll be. And the changes that we've seen don't impact a lot of our clients. I will mention there was, and I mentioned already, there was a caravan of migrants that left Honduras right before the inauguration. It was forcibly turned back in Guatemala. We expect to see more caravans, and this has been a very political issue, like why people are traveling in caravans, and there's a lot of suspicion about it. But and I don't have too much like in-person knowledge of this, but to me it makes a lot of sense if people are being massacred as they transit through Mexico, why people would rather travel in a group than alone to flee the persecution that they're facing in their home countries. And we'll see what the Biden administration's response is. We'll see what the Mexican government's response is. For now, AMLO's approach has been kind of wait and see. You know, we will let the Biden administration do what it says it's going to do, and we'll respond in kind. But at least the perspective from Mexico is the Mexican government has really ducked a lot of its responsibility, and it does share a lot of responsibility for these policies that the Trump administration implemented. It could not have implemented MPP without the cooperation of the Mexican government. It cannot continue to implement Title 42 expulsions to Mexico without the cooperation of Mexico. And Mexico's government could end these expulsions if it wanted to, and for now it has not done so. So we're advocating for changes, and of course our partners at IMDEF and in a bunch of other coalitions are advocating very strongly on both sides of the border. But for now, the answers, you know, we're moving in a better direction, but there's still a lot of challenges. So with that, I'll open up the floor to questions. I don't know if if we've received any so far, but we're happy to respond to any audience questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Dan and Margaret. It was very wonderful to listen to you. Without a doubt, these are pressing issues and should be a priority for both the US and Mexican governments because of the implications for human rights and humanitarian aspect of the issue of migration. And we do have 2 questions, and please, for all the attendees, if you have questions, you can write them down on the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So the first question is from Gonzalo Mercado from Endelon, and the question is, are there any current efforts to push the Biden administration to end Title 42 that we can support? So any of you that would like to answer that one? And also another question from Vania Vergara. In addition to Comar's budget shortfalls, what other causes do you identify at the institutional level in Mexico as problems that affect the processing of refugee applications in Mexico? And of course, as usual, we have just a couple of more minutes, 10 minutes for you to answer. And if there are any more questions, I'll let you know. So.
Sure, I can answer the first question. Of course, you know, as we saw with the tearing apart of families at the U.S. southern border, how that policy came about was, you know, public outcry. You know, our voices do matter, and every single person's actions can have a huge impact. So, for example, on February 23rd, 60 members of Congress sent a letter to Department of Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas asking for an end to Title 42. So one way is, you know, support your representatives that have called for an end to this. Call your local representatives, implore them to end it. Another way to support this is obviously, you know, support immigration justice campaigns that are calling for an end to it, like Immigrant Defenders Law Center, Human Rights First, and other organizations, human rights organizations that are asking for an end to it. And also consider donating to these organizations. You know, we are nonprofit organizations, and we do rely on donations to continue this very important work. And I do want to just mention one other thing that I'm glad to hear that someone is asking about how to support these efforts. And I do want to just say one thing that Daniel has said is very important. I want to highlight in case others want to implore the representatives to push this effort forward also, is that with regard to the Migrant Protection Protocols Program, only active cases right now are being disenrolled from the program. As human rights activists and attorneys, we believe that anyone that had ever been put in the MPP program was subjected to due process failures and harsh conditions and should be able to restart their case. And that's something we would also hope that you encourage your representatives to support.
Great, thanks, Margaret. And I'll take the question on other barriers to seeking asylum in Mexico, if I understood that question to be about that. So apart from Comar's kind of just resource issues, there are some legal barriers that we at Asylum Access and our partner organizations are very concerned about and have been fighting against for years. So one thing in Mexico, if you come into Mexico to seek asylum, you are supposed to apply for asylum within 30 days of entry. Now that is very strict. In the US, you have a year to seek asylum. And actually in the new immigration bill, they're even getting rid of that deadline because there are a lot of reasons that asylum seekers are unable to seek asylum as soon as they get into the country, or even within the first year. So in Mexico, we see a lot of cases of people who fail to apply within 30 days. And that's a big part of the work that we do. Our legal advocacy is fighting on these individual cases to explain why somebody was unable to do so and why they still deserve refugee protection. But that is, it's a significant barrier, and it's a barrier that's very difficult to challenge without legal assistance. So that's one barrier. Another really significant barrier to seeking asylum in Mexico is when you submit an asylum petition in Mexico, you're required by law to stay within the Mexican state where you applied throughout the duration of the process. And again, when these were happening, like when decisions were being issued in 45 days, that's not such an issue. But when people are waiting 18 months, and especially given the restrictions on travel right now, most of the applications are happening in Mexico's southern states, in Chiapas and Tabasco. And those are some of the poorest parts of Mexico. There are very few economic opportunities. They were the areas that were most affected by tropical storms this past fall, and will continue to be impacted by climate change in ways that are pretty severe. So they're not the best places to be waiting for a year, for 18 months in this kind of legal limbo. But that a lot of people are required to do so. So, and we see a lot of cases that are considered abandoned because people leave Tabasco or Chiapas to try to seek asylum elsewhere, or make their way to the United States while their cases are pending. And that's been a pretty significant challenge for our clients, is this requirement that they stay in one place throughout the pendency of their claims. And sometimes it's absurd because the closest, often you have to register, you have to report to Comar usually every 2 weeks to check in. And sometimes people live in an area where they have to cross through another state to get to the closest Comar office, and they're legally abandoning their asylum claim if they do that. So if they take these very circuitous routes to do the things that they're required to do by law. So those are two of the main challenges. And I will just very briefly mention one success that we've seen. Last year, Mexico did change its laws to unequivocally outlaw detention of children throughout Mexico for their migration status. This is a huge, huge victory. It's something that we hope the US can emulate. And if the Biden administration really wants to kind of walk the talk that it is that President Biden made during the campaign about ending family separations, it should follow Mexico's lead and unequivocally end the detention of children for migration status.
Thank you, Dan and Margaret. I will read the last 3 questions, and they are very, of course, we would need another hour probably to discuss these issues. But so there are 3 more questions. One is if there are any current efforts from NGOs in Mexico to lobby or push directly with Mexico's federal government, not only to expedite the asylum process, but also to protect migrants crossing Mexico. That's the question that Eileen Trax is making. And also 2 more questions. One is, are there any efforts being made to encourage the Biden administration to address more of the systemic problems / push factors in Mexico or Central America that motivate migrants to try to enter the US? And the last one, what do you think US federal policy advocacy organizations be focused on with this administration? Is the issue of the externalization of the border one that this administration might address? So we have 4 more minutes, and I'll leave it to you. Thank you.
I'll address the first question very briefly. Yes, there is a very concerted advocacy network within Mexico led by a bunch of really wonderful civil society organizations, and we participate in a lot of these networks to try to push Mexico to do a better job in migrant protection and resolve these issues of asylum and refugee issues. And I'll leave the second question to Margaret, if you don't mind responding.
Yeah, with regard to any, the Biden administration addressing any push factors, we believe that the Biden administration will make a much more concerted effort to actually work with Central American governments and provide aid that had been, that I'm sure had been restricted, and trying to assist on a more of a humanitarian perspective, as opposed to a xenophobic policy. One thing, for example, from what I understand, Biden plans to restore a program that had been in place prior to the Trump administration that allowed children under the age of 18 to apply legally to reunite with their parents already living in the United States that had been terminated under the Trump administration. So that's also one positive thing that we're seeing the Biden administration hopefully restore, that deals with things, on the ground, and not having to force these young children to have to be trafficked through Mexico, for example, to reach their parents in the United States.
Yeah, and then as far as the last question, there are also advocacy efforts, which we and a lot of our partner organizations are part of, to push the Biden administration to really take a different view of what its foreign policy ought to look like regarding asylum and migration in general, to step away from this kind of militarization. Judging by the people who are in place right now, it's a lot of people who were part of the Obama administration, and this stuff did not start with Trump. Obama had similar initiatives to really secure borders, and funneled a lot of money into different police and military operations that are partially aimed at combating trafficking in persons and things like that, which is great, but also tend to exacerbate these problems of militarizing the border and making safe passage more difficult. So we are, I don't want to sound too negative. The administration has done a pretty good job of reaching out through different coalitions to communicate with civil society. They do seem open to listening to our concerns. We have a whole lot more contacts in the administration now than we had 6 months ago, or at least contacts who are at least open to sitting down with us. But I think it will be a complicated issue over the next 4 years. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Margaret.
I would just like to briefly state that, one very important thing that we need to happen right now in this time of reckoning of immigration law is that, it's a time for the administration to re-examine how it was possible for a president to so swiftly and quickly cause such massive human rights violations. It's so expansive. That needs to be re-examined, and we need to ensure that things are put into place to make sure that it doesn't happen again. So this is a really important time for the administration to look at its past policies, Obama's policies, and things that unfortunately made it possible for the Trump administration to cause so much harm.
Yeah, thank you so much. And for all the attendees, don't forget to visit Asylum Access Mexico webpage, and also look for the Immigrant Defenders Law Center. You can find more information and tools and resources and their publications on these issues. And thank you, Dan and Margaret, and to our friends at Brown University for organizing this panel. And I hope to see you soon. Thank you. Thank you all.